Dad gave my childhood bedroom to my stepsister after she moved back home at 28, claiming I didn't need it since I was away at college. But when I came back for summer break and found all my belongings in garbage bags in the garage, I decided to show him exactly what happens when you throw away someone's childhood memories. The text message arrived during my final exam week of sophomore year, just as I was cramming for my organic chemistry test that would determine whether I could maintain my pre-med track. The message was from my father, brief and matter-of-fact in a way that should have warned me something was wrong. He simply wrote that there had been some changes at home and that I should call him when I had a chance to talk. I was buried under academic pressure and assumed the message was about something minor, perhaps a change in summer work arrangements or family vacation plans. My relationship with my father had been somewhat strained since he remarried 3 years earlier, but we maintained polite communication about practical matters. I figured whatever changes he was referring to could wait until after my exams were finished. The semester ended successfully with grades that kept me on track for medical school admission, and I was looking forward to spending the summer at home before starting a research internship at the local hospital. I had been away at college for nearly 2 years, and despite the family dynamics that had shifted since my father's remarriage, I was eager to sleep in my own bed and reconnect with childhood friends. The drive home from college was filled with anticipation and nostalgia. I had been working incredibly hard academically and socially adjusting to college life, and the prospect of a few relaxing weeks at home felt like exactly what I needed. I had plans to catch up with high school friends, work on applications for summer programs, and spend some quality time with my father rebuilding our relationship. When I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, everything looked exactly the same from the outside. The house was a modest 2-story colonial where I had lived since elementary school, and seeing it always brought back warm memories of growing up there. I grabbed my suitcases from the car and headed toward the front door, expecting the usual comfortable homecoming routine. My father greeted me at the door with an awkward hug and an expression that I couldn't quite read. His new wife, Patricia, was standing behind him with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Their body language immediately told me that something was different, but I couldn't figure out what had changed. The living room looked the same, the kitchen was exactly as I remembered it, and everything seemed normal on the surface. When I asked where I should put my suitcases, my father and Patricia exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. Patricia's daughter, Madison, who was 28 years old and had been living in her own apartment across town, had apparently moved back home several months earlier. According to my father, Madison had been going through some personal and financial difficulties and needed family support during this challenging time. The problem was that Madison had moved into my bedroom, claiming the space as her own while I was away at college. My father explained this as if it were a completely reasonable arrangement, pointing out that I was only home during breaks and summer vacation, while Madison needed a stable living situation for an indefinite period. He seemed genuinely surprised that I might have an issue with this arrangement. When I asked where exactly I was supposed to sleep during my summer break, my father gestured vaguely toward the basement, suggesting that we could set up a temporary sleeping area down there. The basement was unfinished, damp, and had been used primarily for storage and laundry. The idea that I was expected to spend my summer vacation sleeping in the basement while my 28-year-old stepsister occupied my childhood bedroom was so absurd that I initially thought he was joking. Patricia jumped in to explain that Madison was going through a difficult divorce and needed emotional support and stability during this transitional period. She emphasized that Madison was family now and that we all needed to make sacrifices to help each other through challenging times. She suggested that as a college student, I should be more flexible and understanding about temporary living arrangements. The conversation continued with increasingly ridiculous justifications for why displacing me from my own bedroom was not only reasonable but actually a generous gesture on my part. They talked about the importance of family unity, the temporary nature of the arrangement, and how my maturity and independence made me the obvious choice to accommodate Madison's needs. When I asked to see my belongings and understand how my personal items were being stored during this transition, my father led me out to the garage with an expression that I now realize was pure guilt. What I found there was devastating in a way that I struggle to articulate even now, years later. All of my childhood belongings, everything that had made my bedroom mine for over a decade, had been unceremoniously dumped into black garbage bags and cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly in the corner of the garage. Photo albums, awards from school, books I had treasured since childhood, artwork I had created over the years, stuffed animals that held sentimental value, and countless other personal items that represented my entire childhood and adolescence. The books were water damaged from a leak in the garage roof that my father had apparently never bothered to fix. Photo albums had been stored without any protection from moisture, causing many of the pictures to stick together and become ruined. Awards and certificates were bent and crumpled from being shoved carelessly into boxes. Clothing that I had left behind was wrinkled and musty from being stored in the damp environment. What made the situation even more painful was discovering that many of my most treasured possessions were simply missing entirely. My collection of music that I had been building since middle school was nowhere to be found. A jewelry box that had belonged to my deceased mother was missing, along with several pieces of her jewelry that I had inherited. Photo albums documenting family vacations and special occasions from my childhood had disappeared completely. When I asked my father about the missing items, he became defensive and evasive. He suggested that perhaps some things had been accidentally donated or thrown away during the cleaning process when Madison moved into the room. He seemed annoyed that I was focusing on material possessions rather than being understanding about the family situation and Madison's need for support. The casualness with which my father discussed the loss and destruction of my childhood memories was perhaps more hurtful than the actual displacement from my bedroom. These weren't just random objects, but tangible connections to my past, my relationship with my deceased mother, and the person I had been before my family structure changed so dramatically. I walked through my former bedroom to see how Madison had transformed the space, and what I found was a complete erasure of any evidence that I had ever lived there. The walls had been repainted in colors that I hated, new furniture had been brought in to replace my childhood furniture, and decorations reflected Madison's adult tastes rather than any acknowledgement that this space had been my sanctuary for years. Madison herself was sprawled across my former bed, talking loudly on her phone and painting her nails, completely comfortable in the space that had been mine. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, she gave me a brief wave and continued her conversation without any apparent awareness or concern about how this situation might affect me. The level of entitlement and complete lack of consideration was breathtaking. Madison had not only taken over my physical space but had done so with such thoroughness that it was as if my previous existence in that room had been completely wiped away. There was no acknowledgement of the displacement, no apparent gratitude for the sacrifice I was being forced to make, and no indication that she viewed this arrangement as temporary. That evening at dinner, I tried to have a rational conversation with my father about the situation and potential solutions. I suggested that perhaps Madison could take the guest room or that we could convert another space in the house for her use. I pointed out that I had been planning to spend the entire summer at home and needed a proper place to live and study. My father's response was dismissive and irritating. He suggested that I was being selfish and materialistic by focusing on possessions and room assignments instead of being supportive of Madison during her difficult time. He pointed out that I was young and adaptable, while Madison was going through a major life crisis and needed stability and family support. Patricia became emotional and accused me of being jealous of the attention and care that Madison was receiving. She suggested that my reaction was rooted in resentment about my father's remarriage and an inability to accept Madison as a legitimate family member. She made it clear that Madison's needs were the priority and that I was expected to adjust my expectations accordingly. The conversation devolved into a lecture about gratitude, flexibility, and family loyalty. My father reminded me that he was paying for my college education and that my summer housing situation was a minor inconvenience compared to the support I was receiving for my academic pursuits. He suggested that many college students would be grateful to have any place to stay during breaks. The complete lack of empathy or understanding was devastating. Not only were they refusing to acknowledge that the situation was unfair, but they were actually trying to make me feel guilty for being upset about it. The gaslighting was so effective that I began to question whether my reaction was reasonable or if I was indeed being selfish and ungrateful. I spent that first night sleeping on an air mattress in the basement, surrounded by boxes of Christmas decorations and old exercise equipment. The space was cold, damp, and completely unsuitable for long-term habitation. Every time the furnace kicked on or the washing machine ran, the noise was disruptive and reminded me of how displaced I felt in my own family home. Over the next few days, I attempted to salvage what I could from my belongings that had been stored in the garage. Many items were beyond repair due to water damage and improper storage, but I managed to save some photographs and documents that held sentimental value. The process of sorting through damaged possessions was emotionally exhausting and made me feel like I was grieving the loss of my childhood all over again. I also began to notice other ways that Madison's presence had changed the dynamics of the household. She had taken over the main bathroom, leaving her products and personal items everywhere without any consideration for other people's needs. She monopolized the television in the living room, controlled the thermostat, and generally behaved as if she were the primary resident of the house while I was merely a temporary guest. The family meal schedule revolved around Madison's preferences and schedule. When she wanted to sleep late, we were expected to keep the house quiet. When she wanted to have friends over, I was expected to make myself scarce. When she needed to use the computer for job searching or personal business, my academic work was considered less important and could wait. The double standard was glaring and painful. While I was expected to be understanding, flexible, and accommodating of Madison's needs, no similar consideration was extended to me. My presence in the house was treated as an imposition rather than a natural right as my father's child and a longtime resident of the home. After about a week of living in these conditions, I realized that this arrangement was not temporary as my father had suggested. Madison had settled into my room as if it were a permanent living situation, and there was no discussion of timeline or expectations for when she might move out. My father and Patricia seemed to view this as a long-term solution that I would eventually accept and adjust to. That's when I decided that if my childhood memories and belongings were going to be treated as garbage, I would show my father exactly what it felt like to have important things thrown away carelessly. I spent several days developing a plan that would demonstrate the impact of his decisions in a way that he couldn't ignore or dismiss. I started by documenting the damage that had been done to my belongings, taking photographs of water-damaged books, ruined photographs, and missing items. I created a detailed inventory of everything that had been lost or destroyed, including sentimental value and estimated replacement costs. The list was extensive and represented years of memories and experiences that could never be truly replaced. Next, I began systematically removing items from the house that held sentimental value for my father. I started with photographs of his own childhood and family memories that were displayed around the house. I carefully took down family portraits, vacation photos, and images that documented important milestones in his life and our family history. I moved these items to the garage, storing them in the same careless manner that my belongings had been treated. I used garbage bags and cardboard boxes, providing no protection from moisture or damage. I stacked them haphazardly in areas where they would be exposed to the same conditions that had ruined my possessions. Over the course of several days, I continued this process with other items that held meaning for my father. His collection of vintage records, books that he had treasured since college, sporting equipment from his youth, and tools that had belonged to his father all found their way to the garage storage area. I was careful to take only items that belonged specifically to my father, avoiding anything that belonged to Patricia or Madison. I wanted the lesson to be targeted and personal, focusing on his own experiences of loss and displacement rather than creating additional family conflict with people who were already antagonistic toward me. The process was emotionally cathartic in some ways, but also deeply sad. I was essentially dismantling the physical representation of my relationship with my father, removing the tangible evidence of our shared history and experiences. Each item I moved to the garage felt like another step away from the family connection that had once been so important to me. My father didn't notice the missing items immediately, which said something about how much attention he was paying to his own surroundings. When he finally realized that his photographs and personal belongings were disappearing, he became confused and concerned, asking me if I had seen certain items or knew what might have happened to them. I responded with the same casual dismissiveness that he had shown when discussing my damaged belongings. I suggested that perhaps some things had been accidentally misplaced during household reorganization or that items might have been moved to make room for Madison's needs. I adopted his own tone and reasoning, reflecting his words back to him. When my father discovered his possessions in the garage, stored in the same careless manner as my belongings had been, his reaction was immediate and intense. He was furious about the lack of care that had been shown to his personal items and demanded an explanation for why his things had been treated so disrespectfully. The irony of his reaction was not lost on me. The same man who had dismissed my concerns about water-damaged photos and missing childhood memories was now outraged that his own possessions had been subjected to similar treatment. The double standard was so obvious that even he seemed to recognize it as he was expressing his anger. I calmly explained that I was simply following the precedent that he had established for how family members' belongings should be handled when space was needed for other priorities. I pointed out that his items were taking up room that could be used for Madison's storage needs, and suggested that he should be more flexible and understanding about temporary inconveniences. When my father accused me of deliberately damaging his belongings out of spite, I reminded him that some of my most treasured possessions had been destroyed through the exact same careless storage methods. I asked him how it felt to see years of memories and sentimental items treated as if they were worthless garbage that could be shoved into bags and forgotten. The conversation that followed was heated and emotional, but for the first time since I had arrived home, my father seemed to genuinely understand the impact of his decisions. Seeing his own possessions treated with the same disregard had given him a perspective on my experience that abstract discussions about fairness had failed to provide. Patricia and Madison were furious about the disruption to their comfortable arrangement, but my father began to question whether the situation had been handled appropriately. The visual demonstration of how it felt to have important belongings treated as disposable had been more effective than any argument I could have made. My father's initial reaction was to demand that I return his belongings to their proper places immediately, but I refused to do so until we could have a serious conversation about the living arrangements and the treatment of my possessions. I pointed out that if his items deserved respect and careful handling, then mine did as well. The standoff continued for several days, with tensions in the household reaching a breaking point. Madison complained constantly about the disruption to her comfortable living situation, while Patricia accused me of manipulating my father through emotional blackmail. However, my father was beginning to see the situation from my perspective for the first time. Eventually, my father agreed to sit down and discuss potential solutions to the housing situation that would be more fair and respectful to everyone involved. The conversation was difficult and emotional, but it was the first time since my arrival that he acknowledged that my needs and feelings were valid and deserved consideration. We ultimately reached a compromise that involved converting the finished basement rec room into a proper living space for Madison, with privacy screens and comfortable furniture that would give her independence while returning my bedroom to me. The solution required some financial investment and effort, but it addressed everyone's needs without forcing anyone to live in unsuitable conditions. The process of returning my belongings to my room and properly organizing them was time-consuming and emotionally healing. Many items had been damaged beyond repair, but recovering what could be saved and returning them to their proper place felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity that had been temporarily lost. My father helped with the restoration process, and during those hours of sorting through damaged photos and reorganizing my space, we had important conversations about respect, family priorities, and the impact of his remarriage on our relationship. He began to understand that his desire to please Patricia and accommodate Madison had led him to disregard my needs and feelings in ways that were hurtful and unfair. The summer ended up being more positive than it had started, though the relationship damage took much longer to fully repair. My father learned important lessons about balancing competing family needs and the importance of treating everyone's belongings and feelings with equal respect. Madison eventually moved into her basement space and, while she was never happy about the arrangement, she managed to create a comfortable living area that met her needs. The experience taught her that her comfort and convenience couldn't come at the expense of other family members' basic rights and dignity. Patricia struggled the most with the resolution, as she had been invested in the idea that Madison's needs should take priority over mine. However, she eventually came to understand that sustainable family harmony required treating all family members fairly rather than playing favorites based on current circumstances. The incident became a turning point in my relationship with my father, though it took years to fully rebuild the trust that had been damaged. He learned that good intentions and family loyalty couldn't justify unfair treatment, and that being a parent meant protecting all of your children's interests, not just accommodating the most demanding family member. Looking back on this experience, I realized that the physical demonstration of displaced belongings was more effective than any conversation could have been in helping my father understand the emotional impact of his decisions. Sometimes people need to experience the consequences of their actions personally before they can develop empathy for others who have been affected. The lesson I learned was that standing up for yourself sometimes requires creative approaches that help others understand your perspective in ways that words alone cannot accomplish. Treating my father's belongings with the same disregard that mine had received was not cruel revenge, but rather an educational demonstration that helped him develop insight into his own behavior. Family relationships often involve power imbalances and competing needs, but sustainable harmony requires finding solutions that respect everyone's basic dignity and rights. My father's initial approach of solving Madison's problems by creating problems for me was fundamentally flawed and unsustainable. The experience also taught me the importance of documenting and preserving family memories, as they can be lost or damaged more easily than we realize. The photographs and mementos that had been ruined represented irreplaceable connections to my past that could never be fully restored. Ultimately, the resolution of this family conflict required my father to invest time, money, and effort into creating a solution that met everyone's needs fairly. The initial approach of displacing me to accommodate Madison had seemed easier, but it created resentment and conflict that was ultimately more difficult to resolve than the practical challenges of creating appropriate space for everyone. The summer that had started with such disappointment and anger ended up strengthening my relationship with my father in unexpected ways. The conflict forced us to have honest conversations about family dynamics, fairness, and respect that we might never have had otherwise. Sometimes the most difficult family experiences lead to the most important growth and understanding.